Hello, this is Chapter 14, Innovation and Tradition, 1350 to 1500. And I just apologize if I look a little hot. I'm in Algeciras on the Mediterranean. At the moment it's very, very warm here. It's quite a sultry evening. Anyway, to business. What you see here in front of you is a image celebrating Prince Henry the Navigator, the person with whom the chapter opens, and in some ways symbolizing a lot of what's happening in this period as Europe starts to forge ahead in the period following the Black Death from a position which was massively behind many other places in the world, like the Ottoman Empire or China, in terms of wealth and sophistication. And so what this chapter tries to address, or one of the things this chapter tries to address, is how this situation comes about and how the Europeans embraced what happened after the Black Death differently, and how this had this consequence of propelling them onto the world stage in a more significant way. So this is the map from the beginning of the chapter, and you can see in purple the areas of the world that start to be connected by maritime trade in this period. So all the way across to North and South America, Western Europe, all the way around the coast of Africa, and into the Indian Ocean and China. And we're thinking about three big polities at this point in time: Western Europe, the Ottoman Empire, and Ming China, and comparing in this chapter how they approach the problems and challenges when networks intersect hierarchies, and how the cultural frames and screens of these places give them different ways of dealing with this intersection between network and hierarchy. So when we think about this period, there's some names that spring to mind. And some of these are very familiar to you because you will probably have been taught this period from a very Western perspective. So people like Ferdinand Magellan and Christopher Columbus, maybe Alfonso Albuquerque, who opened up the Indian Ocean to trade by basically showing up with a whole bunch of cannon mounted to ships and bombarding people into trading with him. And other sailors of the period may be less familiar to you, like Ali Pasha and maybe even Chung He, but they will not be unfamiliar to you after you've finished this chapter. One of the main things I want you to think about as you go through your chapter is right at the beginning of every chapter, there are 2 or 3 bullet points which are under the heading, I'm just finding it right now in my book, framing the argument. And for your final exercise of the day, after reading the textbook and then after reading the source book, answering questions on both, is to practice some historical empathy. Try to put yourself into the character of one of the people who was writing or one of the people that was written about. And so your final exercise for your discussion post is to take on that character and address one of the framing the argument points. And for this chapter, they are the continued growth of maritime networks and how this creates the beginning of the first truly global network. So your character can talk about that. The different opportunities, means, and motives that different societies brought to the exploitation of global maritime networks, or the further responses to the crises of the Mongols and the Black Death in innovations and traditions within different cultural frames. Okay, so those are quite complicated sentences. Take some time to think about what they mean and digest what they mean, maybe even before you start to read in detail, because this is what the chapter is about. Okay, so if you start reading and you get hypnotized by people and places and events, you might miss the underlying analysis and argument of the chapter. So think about those framing the argument aspects first. Another thing to think about as you read the chapter, and sometimes this is something students miss over, is the two sort of critical analyses that go along with the chapter. And so the first, there's always a box that's entitled Issues in Doing World History. And don't skip over this. Okay, in fact, you might even want to go ahead and read this first before you read the rest of the chapter. Because in some ways this addresses the professional aspects of being a historian. And being a historian is not about memorizing names and dates. In fact, many of us professional historians have a really bad memory for names and dates. But it's about doing analysis and looking at what you're doing and thinking about it very, very deeply, and coming up with analytical models. So the issue in doing world history that's highlighted in chapter 14 is about European exceptionalism. In some ways, the way this course is constructed, because it begins in 1500, which coincides with the takeoff of Europe in some ways, can, how should I put this, lead you to sort of buy into this myth of European exceptionalism, because it really is the centuries of European success. And it can make Europe look like it's very special for all the wrong reasons during this period. So read this very carefully, this idea of European exceptionalism. And Europeans did things a little differently, and the success that achieved was not necessarily a foregone conclusion. And think about these things, carefully. Challenge your received wisdom and your assumptions. Don't just buy into this idea that white Europeans somehow had more innovative traditions than other peoples, and this made them more successful. So a third analytical device that you will see as you go through the chapter are the in the margins, there's little boxes called principles and patterns. And these are really crucial that you look at these and think about what it's saying to you, because these are elements of human history that seem to hold true in most cases. For example, on page 430, it talks about the common agrarian pattern in which politics trumps economics. So those people in charge, those with the political power, make decisions that kind of beat out economic decision making. And that's something that holds true for most of history in the agrarian period. And the Europeans do something slightly different, and this makes their trajectory, therefore, a little different. Okay, so that's some things I really wanted to highlight to you, because these are the organizing principles of the chapter that can sometimes be overlooked. Another thing when you're reading is really pay attention to titles. I know that sounds really simplistic and I don't want to patronize you, but I'm terrible for just having my eyes skip over chapter titles and not thinking about them myself. So follow the argument, follow the pattern of the chapter, because it's laid out in those titles, and think, pause, read the chapter title and think, okay, this next section is going to tell me about whatever the title is. It'll help. It sounds stupid, but it will help. Okay, so the chapter opens with talking about some of the crises that Europe faced, and Europe didn't face the Mongol crisis like most of Eurasia, but it did face the Black Death. But the Black Death came in a period when Europe was already weakened by famine. There'd been a long, cold period. Population had grown a lot before the Black Death, and even marginal land was brought under the plough. And as nations began to coalesce, they went to war a lot more. And this picture here shows a scene from the 100-Year War with the English on the right and the French on the left under the banner of Saint-Denis, you can see there. And the 100 Years' War wasn't one long war that lasted 100 years. It was more like a series of battles and skirmishes, but seriously weakened Europe and caused a lot of turmoil, particularly in France, where the war was fought. So there's also war. And the church really isn't doing a lot to make things any easier for people in this period. I've jumped ahead a little too much. Excuse me. There's a position where, because of political situations in Europe, there are rivalries between particularly France and Italy, and France and England. And so the French decide they want their own pope, and they set a pope up in Avignon. The Italians still have their pope. The Germans come along and depose both these popes and put another one in place, and the other two don't go away quietly. So then you've got three popes. So this period we call a schism really is not helping the situation. And then Europe gets hit by the Black Death, and a third to a half of the population die. So this is not sounding like a good basis for a European trajectory that's going to be so successful. One of the things that arrives in the wake of the Black Death are a whole wave of peasant revolts across Europe. And this guy here is a peasant that's been involved in a revolt called the Jacquerie in France. After the Black Death, because there was such a labour shortage and there was such a competition for peasant labourers, peasants actually got a little bit wealthier, and the mosquitoes, excuse me, and the nobles wanted to keep them down, which meant they were even more repressive than they usually were, and this led to peasant revolts. So this map here shows you the political situation in Europe, political and religious together. This is actually wrong. It should be the other way around, and that would make sense. So the green area is the obedience to Avignon popes. This is Avignon, this is France, and the brown area is the obedience to the Roman Pope in Italy and Germany and England. And all these red dots, these are places that had peasant revolts. So you can see this, the situation is troubled, to say the least. So, as I said, peasants, these are some peasants doing what peasants do. Ploughing, you can see he's ploughing 4 rows at once, and they're planting seeds. But as peasant labour becomes more and more hard to find, things start to get very messy in Europe. Okay, so let's look at this in terms of our model. We have a traditional pyramid with 2 things stuck out the side of it. So you can see the colour pink always represents warriors, fighters. So the king and the elites and some local retainers and local levies. But then kind of stuck out the side is also the Pope and the priests, sort of an alternate, but not quite on top, but an alternate elite system. And then this area here, which Murillo describes as a cancer. This is not supposed to be there in the traditional agrarian hierarchy. These are the burgesses, and the blue color always indicates trade networks. So the burgesses, the merchants, the rich merchant, urban people. Okay, so a burgess is somebody who lives in town is also a merchant, or usually a merchant. And this is a group that's growing. It's not contained within the usual hierarchy aside, but it's kind of grown on the side of it like a cancer. And in our cultural frame and screen, we've got the plague, of course, the schism, which refers to the religious conflict with the three popes, and this class conflict that I've talked about, these peasant revolts at this time. And the frame is still stuck in this period of militarized law, and this is how they're trying to cope with what's going on. Okay, and then into this mix, if it wasn't explosive enough, we throw the printing press, which is a very exciting new development, but it means that political, religious ideas can spread much wider in Europe. All this change, though, in most other places, as they try to change to cope with the Mongol invasions and the Black Death, their innovations to cope with these things looked back to tradition. So they looked back to their past, and they held on to their past even more dearly in China, for example, and said, oh, well, these models from the past, they can help us. This is how we're going to get through this. In Europe, so much change and so much chaos is going on, and their rule, their cultural frame, militarized law, didn't do very much to add meaning to the world. And so instead of reaching back to tradition, innovation for innovation's sake really took hold. And so they were more willing to try new things. And even though they would talk about a renaissance and reaching back, what they were doing was actually quite different. And this is, if we talk about European exceptionalism, this is one of the ways that they are different. We won't use the word exceptionalism because that's kind of offensive to everyone else. But this is one of the ways that they're different, is that their innovation is reaching forward instead of backwards. Okay, so I'm going to leave that there for now. I've already gone over my time a little bit, and I'll give you a short part two.